ventilation during fuel-controlled fires is relatively simple. Whereas if we move into moderate and heavy ventilation control, the factors become much more critical.
Yeah.
And the response is much more, has a potential for all sorts of things.
I would say yes and no, because from my point of view, I guess I've been talking about that all the time, because it's really no big difference. It's a difference in practice, but you still have the same. All you really have to remember is that you have high pressure and low pressure, and everything moves from high pressure to low pressure. So if you have a larger fire, a higher temperature, a higher pressure, and you want to move something to a lower pressure, the higher the pressure, the larger the flow. If you have an opening, you have a small opening, you have a higher velocity. But so specifically, ventilation controlled fires, it works the same.
I understand the flow works the same, but we're dealing with gases at a higher temperature and a heavier concentration with more potential for ignition in various types of rapid fire progress.
When I sort of think about fire ventilation, I don't really think about the smoke as smoke. It's basically hot air. So if I heat up the air, the thing with the smoke is that I can see it. And in some cases, like a ventilation controlled fire, you might get you get more particles perhaps in the smoke, you get other kinds of gases, you get more unburnt gases perhaps. But from a ventilation point of view, it's still the same. It's still temperature which will create pressure, and then you will have pressure differential. So it works the same. But you have a good point. You still have to consider that if you have a higher concentration of particles and unburnt fuel in the gases, perhaps you have to think a little bit different, but maybe not. From my point of view, what you do have to think about is where I started. If the fire is fuel controlled or ventilation controlled. I mean, if you provide air to a fuel controlled fire, nothing much will happen. If you provide air to ventilation controlled fire, you can have anything from a tss to a kaboom. And I can't really tell you which, because it depends very much on, I would say in most cases, you would probably get more of the psh than the kabooms. It's not a scientific term. So. Or maybe it is, actually. We can make it one. But it's, well, there are a few more things, just to give you sort of an idea on what's going on in my mind. No jokes about that, thank you. If you don't use a fan, if you have natural ventilation and you vent the fire, you can basically think in a vertical, everything moves sort of from down to up because of the thermal buoyancy and moves up. When you use a fan, you have to turn things around, because then you don't move things from a lower position to a higher position, you move things from left to right. So that's a different sort of thing. In the best cases, and I'll come to this in a minute actually, you should try to create like a flow path, like a hose line, so you actually push things in front of you. That's sort of the key to PPA or PPV. Yeah. So if I can demonstrate that by this. It works. It's a little bit too big. That was pretty good. The thing is, and I've seen this happen in reality a couple of times. Sometimes people try to use fans and positive pressure ventilation in in a large sort of industrial thing like this, or the shopping mall or something, which is a very large area, what happens is that if you use that fan in an apartment fire, you can actually think at it as you get flow through a tube, more or less. If you try to use the fan in a large volume like this, well, if you push air, you will of course increase the outflow, but you will also get the turbulence. So you stir everything around. You won't push anything in front of you anymore. You just stir things around. If that maybe not answer the question a little bit, but
Yeah.
so I don't really make that distinguish between fuel control and ventilation control. Apart from if it's a ventilation controlled fire, you have to think that I'm actually providing air to the fire, with or without the fan.
Yeah. Yeah, I just consider in that situation we have a much higher likelihood of it leading to a more rapid flashover, for example. If we don't take care of whether we use some sort of cooling agent of these gases
Yeah.
to relatively bring them closer to an inert state. That's just my consideration.
Well, it doesn't really matter if you do natural ventilation or positive pressure ventilation.
Yeah.
You can't just vent the fire. You have to use, when you vent the fire, you're supposed to get the smoke and the heat out and fresh air in. You have to sort of use that channel of fresh air to get to the fire or get to inside and search and whatever you want to do. Unless otherwise it's useless to do it. It's not just fire ventilation. You have to, like I said earlier, you have to think fire behavior, fire ventilation, and fire suppression.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, I mean, you can still, by using a fan or by natural ventilation, you can still induce some kind of a flashover or some kind of fire thing in the building. But, I mean, what's the option? Keep it closed? Yeah, you can do that too. Not providing any air to the fire. You can use duct tape all over the building, which will take a few minutes, but you can still do it. And eventually it will go out, in theory. Okay, sorry about that. Large building. So we have to rethink our minds a little bit about the scale here. If you think about that model I had earlier, like a 10th scale of a house, this is more like 25, 30, 50 scale of an industrial. So you would see you have smaller doors and stuff like that. So I have the fire on this side, which heats up the air, the smoke. I get a higher pressure. And I open the outlet. I shut that off on it. And I get smoke out. What am I missing? The inlet, exactly. So I make an inlet, and when I do that, you will see that the flow actually increases. A little bit, but still you can see a difference. And for those of you who are sitting on this side, hopefully you can see that through the door, I get air in and I get smoke out. This is very simple. But I still have to, if I close this again, I won't get much smoke out. And I can open several openings, like this. And the flow goes down since the velocity goes down. Larger openings, total. A low velocity, the same flow, or even more perhaps. I can make more openings. No inlets. Let me close those again. Just to save Steve a little bit here. What happens over here? in those two. Do I get any smoke up?
Air inside.
I get air in, exactly. If I open too much outlets, I won't get any air out, smoke out, because suddenly I have created an inlet here. And we often, in the scientific community, we often unfortunately think of that when you have a fire in a room and you fill up the room with fire gases, you consider the fire gases to be the same temperature, all of it. But as we know, that's not the case, because I have a temperature differential in that way and I have it in that way. So this is closer to the fire. So I have a higher temperature and higher pressure coming out this way, a higher pressure differential in this way. This is lower temperature over here because it's further away from the fire. So I will get air in. But, oops, sorry. If I make an inlet down here, not enough, one more. I will get smoke out through all four. So consequently, I have outlets, but I also need inlets, which is very important. Close this again. And we're going to make some more smoke on here. And like I said, I've seen people trying to use a fan in large buildings like this. Small fan, another scale. Well, I can use a bigger fan if you like, and you will get the same result. So, I create the outlet. I'll make it bigger. And I have the inlet over here, and I put the fan in here. And hopefully some of you can see that the flow of gases out of the building, of course, it increases, but I also get all the turbulence inside. So in the apartment case, you sort of you push the smoke in front of you. In a large industrial or large volume, all you do is, well, not all you do, but you create a lot of turbulence. So what used to be probably a kind of a nice situation where you have hot gases on top of you and pretty visibility down below, suddenly you change that so you can't see shit. Everything becomes full of smoke.
And what size structure would you say that this effect starts to occur? It depends, I know.
Was that sufficient answer?
Yeah.
No, I can actually say that if you stick to sort of ordinary family houses, apartments, dwellings, any type of building where you have sort of a standard room height, 2.5 meters or something, rooms of this size perhaps, several rooms of this size, corridors, just fine. If you go up to where you have volumes of anything more than 3 or 4 meters in height, or you have like 200 or 300 square meters, you should try to avoid it. I remember your presentation, where you've looked at how things changed in the United States when it comes to floor area in family houses, which has changed from, I can't remember the figures, but
1,600 to 2,600 square feet.
yeah. So it doubled within a 10-year period, more or less.
30 years.
30 years, that's right. So when you go find those large family houses where you have several hundred square meters, because you don't know where you're pushing things. The best case when you use a fan would be where you have a very sort of clear path from the inlet to the exhaust opening, where you actually push things in front of you. As soon as you're not sure which way is it going, you should avoid it. What you can do in large buildings is that this side is still unaffected. So what you can do is that you can use the fan to pressurize this side, like that. And even if I open up in between, I won't get any flow. If I take the fan away, it'll come back. If I put the fan back, I pressurize this side, and I have smoke here. Example, this part of the building is lost. You still have something you want to save in here, perhaps. Machinery, equipment, computers, whatever. Pressurize this side and bring it all out. Or you can even, instead of having this scenario, and you start your fire attack from here, if you pressurize this side, you might even be able to get your crew up there and start the fire attack from there, which should be, in some cases, a lot easier.
With fresh air coming in from behind.
Yeah.
But it's important to have a small, any leakage or a small opening in the smoking part, because if it's a really close room, the pressure will be deleted or neutralized, and then you will get a smoke out also with the fan. If the smoke can't go out and you see the leakage, because of this, the fresh air goes in the smoke room.
But that's usually not a big problem in a real building, because you always have leakage
But in a
areas.
very new house, eventually,
Yeah,
with the new
yes,
techniques,
yes, yes.
it could happen.
And that's, we had this discussion this morning. That's another thing that we don't often bring into the equation. That's the building construction. And it's even more complicated than that, because we have, in this country, we have a lot of buildings that are 100 years old, large buildings, 4 or 5 story buildings. So we have to be aware of the changes in the building code of the time, and changes in floor area perhaps, and leakage. In a newer building, you would probably have like some kind of ventilation system, or even an air conditioning system, which means the building is very close. In an older building, you won't have that. So you have more leakage areas in an older building, probably, than in a newer building. So we also have to consider that. So this is venting a building it's easy to say from high pressure to low pressure. Very easy. But in reality, it's very complicated, because you have so many things to consider. And then I can add wind. Thank you very much, sir. I talk to you later. Which makes it even harder, actually.
The same thing is done in huge houses or staircases which are automatic pressurized. You get an automatic fire alarm. And then the system is also a small window will open in a flat. The staircase is pressurized by the automatic system. And if the door to the flat or to the floor opens, you get automatically the flow, and the 50 Pascal, which the staircase has to meet, will stay, because the ventilation system is engineering calculated to stay all the time at 50 Pascal. Or if a complete door is open and you get a flow of 2 meters a second, you need to have in Europe 15, and in USA I think 25 Pascal now. So there it's also done or used like that.
Houses are not just houses anymore. They're engineered houses. Keep the engineers out of it. A lot easier. Okay, and I'm gonna try to pretty quick move on to my last model. Any questions so far? Are you with me so far? Or am I speaking?
One question.
You know all this already?
Let's say you have one of the ventilation openings on the roof. I don't know what you call it, ventilation
you a big fan and you have just one window open, you can overcome it. But in the real world, in the first phase of the invention, you've only got a small fan, so close it. Also in the staircase, just open the window a little bit and not more, because if not, you lose all the pressure to keep the staircase free of smoke.
That relates to a remark or question by Lars just a couple of minutes ago, before we started. Let's say I have a fire in here, full of smoke, and I want to pressurize this side. And I do that, I pressurize it, I set up my fan back here, and I open up. And for some reason, I have an opening here. There is a small chance or risk that if I do like this, I will not really have, it's all closed. The flow will basically be from here over here, and I have some leakage area over here. If I open up here, suddenly I will create a flow from this opening in the back to over here. So there is a small, well, not small, there is a risk that due to that flow, I will create some flow in this room. So I will perhaps get some smoke, sort of a suction thing, from this room to this room.
It'll still be very slow, though.
Probably.
Because you are pressurizing this side, so that is still a higher pressure than that side.
Depends on the leakage area in here.
Right.
So I mean, if I have a very small leakage area in here,
Right. It's not
the
all
risk
of a
is
sudden
probably
gonna be like,
no.
woo, and all of a sudden
No.
it's going out through the roof opening. So it's no
There's-
matter what, it's a higher pressure than without the fan. So
There-
you're going to slow down the effect of
Yeah.
having that connecting door open.
But I mean
It's
that's
not going to create a huge hazard right away.
no, but
You have
it's
to-
still a phenomena that I might.
Oh, absolutely.
meet, so-
But it's not like sudden death if
No.
if that opens up.
Would be interesting though.
From the